Braxton County sits at the geographic center of West Virginia, and in the early autumn of 1952, that fact carried a particular kind of weight. To stand anywhere in that county and look outward was to look toward ridges, folded, forested, running roughly southwest to northeast in the manner of the whole Appalachian Plateau. The ridges rose and fell without interruption, each one pushing the next into the distance, until the furthest visible line of trees dissolved into the pale haze of the September horizon. The hollows between them held narrow creek bottoms, most of them unnamed, on any map a stranger might carry, and along those creeks the unpaved roads ran, not straight, because nothing in that terrain ran straight, but following the water, as roads in Appalachian country have always followed the water, curving into shadow under the canopy of second-growth oak and maple and hickory that had reclaimed every hillside where the timber crews had worked a generation before. The roads were unpaved and the distances were real. A community separated from its nearest neighbor by a single ridge was, in the practical terms of 1952, separated by the better part of an afternoon's travel on roads that turned to deep mud in wet weather and kicked up pale dust in dry. Braxton County covered just under 500 square miles of that terrain, and the county seat of Sutton, with its courthouse and its handful of storefronts and its small weekly newspaper, sat in the approximate center of those miles, like a pin on a map that is mostly topographic relief. For the families living in the unincorporated communities scattered through the surrounding hills, Sutton was where county business happened, where the paper was printed, where the larger world arrived in whatever attenuated form it arrived in at all. Flatwoods was not a town in any administrative sense. It was a scatter of families along the roads and hollows of a particular part of the county, most of them living on land that had been in the same family lines for several generations, the houses modest and practical and oriented toward work rather than toward any center. The community had no incorporated boundary, no population figure in any census column that could be cleanly separated from the surrounding rural landscape. It had families, and those families had names that had been in Braxton County long enough to seem continuous with the hills themselves. Scots, Irish, and English Appalachian lines that had come into this part of the mountains 2 centuries before and had stayed, generation after generation, working the same kinds of ground in the same kinds of ways. The economy of the county in 1952 rested on what the land offered and what the land required. Subsistence farming occupied most households to some degree. Kitchen gardens, small livestock operations, the work of keeping a family fed across a full calendar year in terrain where the growing season was reliable enough, but the winters were long and the soil on the steeper slopes gave only grudgingly. Timber work drew men into the hills when the farming calendar allowed, and there was coal work for those who could find it. Though Braxton County sat north of the main coal seam country, and the work was less constant than it was further south, money was not plentiful and was not expected to be plentiful. What was expected was a full woodpile before the cold came, a root cellar with enough put away, and a community of neighbors close enough in spirit, if not always in distance, to call on when the work required more hands than one household could provide. The evenings in Flatwoods in September 1952 were defined by a particular kind of quiet. The sun left the hollow floors before it left the ridgelines, which meant the transition from afternoon to dusk happened in stages, first the ground going dark while the treetops still held the last pale gold of the light, then the ridgeline silhouettes sharpening against a sky that had not yet fully given up its color, and then the full dark coming, absolute and unqualified in a landscape with no ambient glow from any nearby population center to soften it. The stars were clear on cloudless nights. The roads were empty by any standard a person accustomed to towns or cities would recognize. The sounds were the sounds of insects and creek water and the occasional far call of a night bird. And in the farmhouses along the hollows, the windows lit from inside with kerosene lamps made warm contained rectangles of amber light against the surrounding black of the wooded hills. The radio was how the outside world arrived. In a Flatwoods home in the autumn of 1952, the radio sat on its shelf in the main room and produced whatever it could pull from the nearest transmitter. Farm reports and weather and local announcements in the afternoons. And in the evenings, the network programs that had become the texture of American domestic life in the post-war years. News broadcasts came at regular intervals, read in the careful, slightly formal diction of the period, and the news in September of 1952 was the kind of news that placed a steady, low-level pressure on ordinary life without announcing itself as pressure. The Korean War was in its third year. The armistice negotiations at Panmunjom were stalled. American casualties continued to accumulate in numbers that were reported regularly enough that the numbers had stopped being shocking and had simply become part of the persistent background condition of the time. The Soviet Union had tested its first atomic device in August of 1949, less than 3 years before. That event had arrived in American public life with a force that is difficult to fully reconstruct from the outside, because it changed not just what was possible, but what was necessary to contemplate. Before the Soviet test, the American nuclear monopoly had provided a particular kind of distance from catastrophe. The weapons existed, had been used, were real and terrible, but they were held by one side only, and that asymmetry had functioned as a provisional guarantee that the worst of what the weapons could do was held in check by the fact of sole possession. After August 1949, that guarantee dissolved. The Soviet Union had the device, was building more of them, and had demonstrated in the same years that it was capable of extending its influence across Eastern Europe and into Asia with a speed and determination that the American government's own analysts had not fully anticipated. The civil defense apparatus that grew from this changed situation reached into ordinary American life in ways that were neither subtle nor incidental. The Federal Civil Defense Administration was established in January of 1951, and in the months and years that followed, it produced a sustained campaign of public information, pamphlets, posters, instructional films, radio announcements, school exercises, and printed guidance distributed through local government offices, community organizations, and commercial establishments designed to prepare the civilian population for the possibility of Soviet aerial attack. The materials were practical in tone. They described blast zones and fallout patterns. They explained shelter building and evacuation procedures. They showed ordinary families in ordinary homes going through the steps of preparedness with a calm competence that was meant to be reassuring and was not quite entirely reassuring, because the need for the preparation was the thing the preparation never managed to fully normalize. In a Braxton County general store in 1952, among the almanacs and the seed catalogs and the farm supply notices tacked above the counter, a civil defense pamphlet might sit folded on a shelf or pinned to a board near the door, cheap paper, plain black text, with a stylized illustration on the cover showing an aircraft silhouette against a simplified sky. The pamphlet did not announce itself as alarming, it announced itself as useful, but its presence and the presence of others like it in the post offices, and schools and community meeting halls of every county in the country accumulated into something that was not quite alarm and not quite reassurance, but occupied the specific register that lies between them. A readiness, provisional and ongoing, to look up at the sky when something unusual appeared there. The disposition to look at the sky and to take seriously what was seen there had been further organized by events that predated the Civil Defense Campaign, but fed directly into it. On June 24, 1947, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying a small aircraft near Mount Rainier in Washington state when he observed a formation of 9 objects moving at a speed he estimated, on the basis of elapsed time between 2 landmarks, as far exceeding that of any known aircraft. Arnold described the objects as crescent-shaped, or at least as something close to crescent-shaped. His actual description involved a particular kind of boomerang, or bat-like form, but the phrase a journalist used to characterize their motion, comparing it to a saucer skipped across water, passed quickly into general use. The flying saucer was named, and its name gave the thing a category, and the category organized what followed. What followed was substantial. The Army Air Forces, which had reorganized into the independent United States Air Force that same year, established Project Sign in late 1947 to investigate the growing catalog of aerial anomaly reports being filed by pilots, military personnel, and civilians. Project Sign produced an internal estimate in 1948 that some of the reported objects might be of extraterrestrial origin, an estimate that was, reportedly, rejected by the Air Force Chief of Staff and was not published. Project Sign was redesignated Project Grudge in 1949, and the character of the investigation shifted toward an emphasis on conventional explanation. Project Grudge became Project Blue Book in 1952, the same year the Flatwoods incident occurred, and by the autumn of 1952, Project Blue Book was logging cases at a rate that reflected the particular intensity of aerial observation that year. Kenneth Arnold's signed statement to the Army Air Forces, his account set down in the careful, clipped language of an official document with corrections made by hand in the margins, was the opening entry in a file that would eventually fill thousands of pages across more than 2 decades of Air Force investigation. In 1947, the file sat at Wright Field, Ohio, newly started, the paper still crisp in a folder that had not yet acquired the specific density that accumulates in an active investigation over years. The case was 2 weeks old, the investigation was barely begun, and the country's relationship to the question of what might be in the sky had already changed in ways that would not easily reverse. The 5 years between Arnold's sighting and the autumn of 1952 had produced not resolution, but accumulation. The reports continued to arrive, from pilots who had no reason to fabricate accounts that could complicate their professional standing, from military personnel who filed their observations through official channels with the same careful language they used for any operational report, from civilians across every region of the country who had seen things in the sky that they could not place against any known aircraft type or atmospheric phenomenon, and who had, for that reason, reported what they had seen. Project Blue Book received and logged and investigated, and in most cases eventually assigned a conventional explanation: weather balloon, astronomical event, aircraft at unusual angle, anomalous atmospheric refraction. But the cases that received conventional explanations were not the ones that stayed in circulation. The ones that stayed were the ones where the conventional explanation had not quite closed around the report without leaving a visible gap. By September of 1952, the atmosphere in Braxton County, and in every comparable rural community across the United States, was one in which the sky had acquired a weight of attention that it had not carried in the same way in previous decades. This was not uniform anxiety, it was not organized fear, it was more the specific quality of a time when the horizon had acquired new significance, when the sound of an aircraft engine at night might trigger a calculation, however brief and unconscious, about whether the aircraft was domestic or foreign, military or civilian, expected or unexpected. The civil defense drills in schools had made children familiar with the physical posture of sheltering. The news broadcasts had made the reality of Soviet air capability a regular fixture of the evening report. The flying saucer reports had made the sky itself a subject of genuine, sustained public attention in a way that the sky had not been a subject before Arnold's observation gave the attention a name and a category. In a Flatwoods household, on a September evening in 1952, the radio's news broadcast was the window through which all of this arrived. The announcer's voice, flattened slightly by the quality of the transmission through the nearest relay, moved through the evening's items: the war in Korea, the negotiations, the production figures, the diplomatic developments in Europe, with the steady pacing of a man whose professional responsibility was to deliver information without editorial excess. The lamp on the table threw a circle of warm light across the room, and beyond the circle the windows were dark, and beyond the windows the forested hills rose to the same ridgelines they had always occupied, unchanged by the news that moved through the room from the set on the shelf. The families of Flatwoods were not, in any documented or likely sense, preoccupied with the flying saucer reports or the civil defense materials in the way that people in cities with access to more concentrated media might have been. Their preoccupations were particular and proximate: the harvest, the weather, the school year beginning, the work that needed doing before the cold arrived. But the context existed around them regardless of whether it was consciously held, the way all cultural atmospheres exist around the people who live inside them, informing what counts as notable, what triggers watchfulness, what a person does when they see something in the sky that they cannot immediately place against any familiar category. The unpaved roads of Braxton County ran between those communities in the specific way that roads run, in a terrain defined entirely by topography rather than by any grid or plan. They followed the contours. They crossed the creek bottoms at the lowest available fords. They climbed the ridges by the routes of least resistance, which in that country were often the routes that offered the longest approach and the most gradual grade, rather than the most direct line. And so the distances between places were not the distances a map suggested, but the distances the roads actually covered, which were always longer. At dusk on those roads, the tree line came close on both sides, and the last light caught the tops of the ridges, while the hollow beneath filled with shadow in a progression that moved from the ground upward, the dark rising through the lower branches and reaching the canopy only after the crest of the ridge had held the last of the daylight for some minutes, and then finally given that up as well. The community of Flatwoods occupied one hollow among the many such hollows that defined the county, its families connected to one another and to Sutton by those roads and by the relationships that develop naturally and durably in small communities where the same surnames appear across generations, and the work of surviving a particular kind of terrain builds a shared practical vocabulary. The Bailey Fisher Farm was one property among many in the area, its fields and woodlots unremarkable in the landscape of that September, the hill at its crest just one more forested rise, in a county built entirely from forested rises, grass covered on the upper slope where the grazing had kept the trees back, the tree line taking over at the crest, as it always did, where livestock did not reach. The week's edition of the Braxton Democrat was assembled each week in the paper's small office in Sutton. The room smelled of ink and paper, and the specific mineral warmth of metal type, and the single overhead bulb lit the compositor's work with a light that was sufficient and unambiguous, the light of a room built entirely around function. The editor and co-editor worked through the week's material, local announcements, court records, notices of community events, the items submitted by readers and correspondents from the outlying communities, and laid it out in columns with the careful economy of a press that knew exactly how many column inches it had to fill, and had never had cause to regard that constraint as a limitation rather than a discipline. The paper went to its readers each week with the news that Braxton County generated, which was, most weeks, the news of a self-contained rural community going about its ordinary business at the center of a state that most of the country, most of the time, had no particular occasion to think about. The radio in the corner of a Flatwoods home on a September evening was not different in kind from the radio in the corner of a farmhouse in Ohio or Missouri or the rural counties of Georgia or Oregon. The network carried the same news across all of it. The same announcer's voice, or one indistinguishable from it, described the same Korean peninsula stalemate and the same Soviet capability and the same diplomatic maneuverings in the same careful, modulated tones. What differed was what the voice arrived into, the specific domestic space, the specific quality of the surrounding dark, the specific character of a terrain that did not buffer its residents from either the weather or the silence the way that towns and cities do. On a clear September night in Braxton County, the stars were visible in numbers that people accustomed to any kind of light pollution would find remarkable. The sky at full dark was not the diminished, particulate sky of a city, but something older and wider and less organized, the Milky Way, a genuine smear of cold light across the black from horizon to horizon on nights when the moon was low or absent. The hills on either side of any given hollow defined the visible slice of that sky, cutting it into a long ribbon between the ridge lines, and on the farms and along the roads, that ribbon of sky was the sky, not an abstraction, but the actual ceiling of the world as experienced from that ground on that night. In September of 1952, a family gathered around the radio in a Flatwoods home on an evening would have heard the news of the Korean War progress or stall, the diplomatic situation, the condition of the world as the broadcast understood and reported it. The sound would have filled the room in the particular way that radio filled rooms before television changed. What filling a room with sound and image meant, not competing with the rest of the room's activity, but providing a background against which the room's activity continued, a ribbon of the outside world, threading through the domestic foreground of lamplight and dinner conversation, and the sounds of children moving through adjacent spaces. Beyond the windows, the hills were dark. The road outside, if visible at all, was a pale line between darker borders, disappearing into the tree canopy a short distance in either direction. The sky above Braxton County that September was the same sky it had always been over those hills, and the hills were the same hills they had always been, and the families in the hollow communities were the same kinds of families that had occupied that terrain for 2 centuries. The civil defense pamphlets were new. The language of flying saucers was new. The specific quality of aerial vigilance was new, the product of a particular 5-year accumulation of news and official investigation and public discourse that had collectively organized the sky as a space to watch with a kind of attention it had not previously required. The hills did not change. The sky held what it had always held, and in September of 1952, perhaps something else, and in the farmhouses below, the radios ran and the lamps burned, and the families sat within the warmth of the rooms that the windows separated from the darkening world outside. The Braxton County General Store, its shelves carrying what the county required, had no category for the information that would arrive in its community in the second week of September 1952. The newspapers it stocked carried the same Korean War developments and the same civil defense advisories as the radio, organized into columns and headlines by people who understood the conventions of organizing the world's information into a form that could be held in the hands and read. The pamphlet near the door, with its aircraft silhouette and its plain instructional text, was the government's attempt to make the dangerous comprehensible through preparation, and it succeeded as such. Attempts always partly succeed by making the danger specific enough to respond to and general enough to live alongside without paralysis. The October issues of the Braxton Democrat, when they appeared, would carry items about the harvest and the school year in the county's ordinary proceedings, as they always did. The September issues carried what September generated. The week of September 12, 1952, generated what it generated, and the paper's office on its quiet street in Sutton did not yet know that. The type was set for other items. The ink in its containers had no awareness of what it was about to be asked to print. The overhead bulb burned in the empty room through the early evening of September 12th, with the steady, indifferent constancy of a bulb burning in a room where nothing has yet happened that requires a bulb to have been burning. In Flatwoods, the radio in a family's main room was tuned to the evening broadcast. The news moved through the room in its familiar order: the war, the negotiations, the political developments, an item about Soviet air activity that carried the specific weight of a mention that was meant to inform without alarming, and achieved neither quite fully. The children moved through the house or sat near the lamp. The windows were dark. The wooded hills beyond the windows were darker. The sky above the ridgeline, visible in a narrow band above the tree canopy from the doorway, if anyone went to the doorway, held the last blue-gray of the September dusk before it, too completed its transition, and gave the full night over to the stars. The sound of the radio filled the room. Outside, the hills were quiet, and the sky was clear, and the night had the particular weight of nights in that country and that season, watchful in the specific low-register way of a year, when ordinary people had acquired the habit of attending to the sky with a care that earlier generations had not needed to develop, and had not developed, and now could not quite put down. Kathleen May ran a beauty shop out of the Flatwoods area, a practical and well-regarded woman whose days had the particular shape of someone who knows most of the faces in a small community by name. She kept a counter with scissors and combs laid out in careful order. She knew the weight of an ordinary Tuesday in early September, the slight cooling in the air, the light already changing, the afternoons growing shorter in the way that Appalachian September afternoons do, the ridgeline holding the last warmth while the creek bottoms go cool and dark. On the evening of September 12, 1952, Kathleen May was at home in the way that mothers are at home in the early evening, present, attentive to the sounds of the house and the yard, her attention distributed between small tasks and the voices of her children outside. Nothing about the evening announced itself as different from any other. Her sons Edward and Freddie were outside in the fading light, as boys in Flatwoods were on summer's last evenings. The Fisher Farm property stretched on the hill above the community, a piece of Braxton County topography familiar to every child in the area. A long rise of pasture ground running up through scattered trees to a crest that you could reach on foot in a few minutes if you moved at a boy's pace. The hill was ordinary in the way that the hills in that part of West Virginia are all ordinary, which is to say they are steep and forested and close, pressing in on the small cleared spaces where people have built their lives. The boys would have known that hill the way children know every piece of ground within running distance of their house, not as landscape, but as territory, as a place with its specific moods and textures in different lights and seasons. What Edward and Freddie May saw that evening in the sky above and beyond that familiar ridge was not familiar at all. Both boys described a bright object crossing the sky and appearing to descend, settling or landing somewhere on or near the crest of the Fisher Farm Hill. The object was bright, moving, and then still, or at least it ceased to move across the sky and appeared to come to rest in the direction of the hill's high point. The boys ran. They ran down to the house in the way that children run when they have seen something they do not have the words for yet, breathless and urgent, their account arriving in pieces, something in the sky, something on the hill, up there, above the ridge. We saw it come down. Kathleen May received this account in the way that a practical woman receives an urgent report from her children. She listened, she assessed, and she took it seriously enough to act on. The decision to walk up the hill was not dramatic. It was the decision of a community where people looked out for one another, where an unusual thing reported by children was worth an adult's investigation, and where the sky had been for several years the kind of thing that ordinary Americans paid attention to. Kathleen May did not go alone. In the way that neighborhoods work in small rural communities, the word spread quickly to nearby houses, to the children who were still out in the early dark, to a 17-year-old who had the particular confidence and physical capability that made him the natural choice to lead a group of people up a hill in the dark. The group assembled at the base of the Fisher Farm Hill with the ease of neighbors gathering around something worth seeing together. No plan, no preparation, simply a collection of people drawn by the same report and willing to walk toward it. Neil Whirling and Tommy Heyer were neighborhood children, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, drawn into the group by the same contagion of excited curiosity that pulls children toward any reported strangeness in the immediate vicinity of their home ground. They were the kind of boys who would have been hard to convince to stay behind. Their presence on the hill that evening was entirely natural. This was their neighborhood, their hill, their ordinary evening, and something had been reported on it that every child in earshot wanted to see. They came along because that is what children do when the air carries a report of something unusual on a familiar piece of ground. Their ages mattered later when investigators and journalists began sorting through the account, noting that the witness group included several children young enough to be considered impressionable, a point that would be raised in skeptical assessments of the testimony. But on the evening itself, their presence was simply the presence of two neighborhood boys who had not been left out. Eugene Lemon was 17 years old and a member of the National Guard, a detail that placed him in the informal social logic of a small Appalachian community in 1952. As a young man of a certain standing, responsible, physical, the kind of person you trusted with a flashlight at the front of a group going up a dark hill. He had a dog, a medium-sized mixed-breed animal that had been with him when he joined the group, and the dog went ahead of them as they climbed. Eugene Lemon was not the most senior person in the group, that was Kathleen May, but he was the one who carried the flashlight, which gave him a particular function in the geography of what was about to happen. The flashlight was a standard cylindrical battery torch of the kind common in early 1950s households. A simple tool, reliable. its beam a fixed cone of pale light that made everything within it visible and everything outside it darker by comparison. The flashlight sat on a table inside the May house before they left. It was an ordinary object in an ordinary room, the kind of detail that no one would have thought to note, except that it became, in the account that witnesses would tell for the rest of their lives, one of the central instruments of the evening. Eugene Lemon picked it up and switched it on, and the group moved out together toward the Fisher Farm Hill, with the quiet ordinariness of people doing something they considered reasonable, even necessary. The night was early September in West Virginia, which meant the air had that particular quality of a warm season beginning to release, still mild, carrying the smell of late summer grass and the damp of creek bottom air rising on the slope. The sky above the ridge not yet entirely dark, a faint residual light holding in the west. The walk from the May house to the base of the Fisher Farm Hill was short. This was not a distant place. The hill was visible from the community, its crest familiar, its slope a piece of ground that belonged to the ordinary geography of Flatwoods, the way all such hills belong to the communities that live beneath them. Present, unregarded, part of the landscape's regular furniture, the group moved along the path that led up toward the crest with no particular urgency and no particular plan. Kathleen May walked with her sons. The younger boys moved through the group the way children move through a group of adults on a shared task, sometimes ahead, sometimes alongside, occasionally lagging to look at something and then catching up. Eugene Lemon and his dog were out front, the flashlight pointing up the slope. Kathleen May, walking up that hill, was a specific person with a specific life, not a figure in a story, not a representative of anything, but a woman who ran a beauty shop in a small West Virginia community, and who had decided, on a Tuesday evening in September, to walk up the hill behind her neighborhood to find out what her sons had seen. That specificity mattered. It would matter more in the months and years that followed, when her account became the central document of the Flatwoods incident, the most detailed and most consistently maintained piece of testimony the record contains. She spoke steadily, she remembered precisely, and she would repeat what she remembered in interviews and on television and in conversations with investigators for decades, always with the same particular details, always returning to the same images, always describing what she had seen in the same language she had used in the first hours after the encounter. Freddie May was one of the two boys whose observation had started everything. His age placed him among the children in the group, old enough to be a credible witness, and young enough that some investigators would later note the impressionable quality of a child's perception in stressful circumstances. He had been playing outside when the light crossed the sky, which meant his encounter with the evening's events began before anyone else's in the group except his brothers. He had seen the object in the sky, had been among the first to point to the hill and say that it had come down there. His sense of the evening was not the adult sense of going to investigate something reported by children, but the child's sense of having seen something real and wanting someone older to confirm it. Edward May, Freddie's brother, had been with him when the light crossed the sky. Together they had watched it, and together they had run back to the house, and together they joined the group that walked back up toward the place where it had seemed to land. Both boys would give accounts of what they had seen in the sky, consistent with what was later confirmed as a meteor event over the region that evening, a large bright object moving across the sky before descending in the direction of the hills. What drew the meteor's trajectory into the specific local geography of Flatwoods, pulling it down from the general sky into the particular crest of the Fisher Farm Hill, was the boys' account and the direction of their attention, They had watched it descend in that direction, and that direction was the hill they knew. The composition of the group matters to any careful reading of the Flatwoods incident because the witnesses were not a uniform body of people. They were specific individuals with different ages, different vantages, different capacities for observation under stress, and different experiences of what happened on that hill. Some investigators would later weigh the testimony of children more lightly than that of adults. Others would note that children, in certain respects, observe with less interpretive overlay. They report what they see rather than what they expect to see. The truth of these competing claims is not something the record resolves. What the record holds is that each person who walked up that hill that evening was a distinct human being, and that each one of them came back down, describing the same thing. A. Lee Stewart Jr. was not part of the group that walked up the hill. He arrived afterward, drawn by the word that was already spreading through the small community by the time the group had returned from the crest, the account moving from house to house in the way that accounts move through tight rural communities, where people know each other and where something unusual is news in the most immediate sense. Stewart was the co-editor and a reporter at the Braxton Democrat, the county's newspaper based in Sutton, about 3 miles from Flatwoods. He had the professional reflex of a small-town reporter who understood that the best accounts are the ones obtained closest to the event, not the next morning, not after people have slept on it and begun to reconstruct, but immediately, while the experience is still sitting on top of the witnesses and their words are still shaped by it. The Braxton Democrat was a small paper in the way that small-town papers are small, physically compact, locally staffed, its pages laid out by hand in a building in Sutton that smelled of ink and paper and the close air of a working press room. Stewart would have understood his job that night as the job of any reporter arriving first at a story: gather accounts, record details, note names, establish the sequence of events while the sequence is still clear in the minds of the people who lived through it. He was not arriving with a theory, he was arriving with a notepad, and with the particular attention of someone trained to listen carefully and write down what he heard. He found the witnesses gathered in the May house, and he sat down across from Kathleen May while the evening was still recent. His notepad was a working document, not a formal record, not a legal deposition, but a reporter's field notes taken in the kind of shorthand that turns a spoken account into penciled marks on a small page. Witness names, quoted phrases, the sequence of events as Kathleen May and the others described them, a rough sketch perhaps of the hill, the base, the slope, the crest where the figure had been reported, the tree line where Eugene Lemon's flashlight had found the shape. The details accumulated on the page in real time, and Stewart would have been aware, even as he wrote, that the account was unusual in specific and not easily dismissed ways. Eugene Lemon sat somewhere in that room, or nearby, while the early interviews were conducted. He was 17, and had been until that evening simply a young National Guardsman in a small West Virginia community, a young man with a dog and a flashlight, and a Tuesday evening that was supposed to be ordinary. What had happened to him on the hill was not yet fully legible, even to him. He had been the one with the flashlight, the one at the front of the group, which meant he had been the one closest to what the flashlight found. His immediate physical condition in the hours after the encounter was notable enough that witnesses and investigators mentioned it specifically and consistently. His voice was impaired. His coordination was disrupted. He had been sick. He could not describe what he had seen in coherent language in the immediate aftermath. These were not the effects of excitement alone. They were the effects of something the witnesses described as physical, something in the air on that hillside that had acted on the body. The younger boys, Neil Whirling and Tommy Heyer, had run down the hill ahead of the adults. Their panic on the descent was mentioned in the early accounts, one of the children described as near hysterical by the time the group reached level ground again. A child near hysterical at the bottom of a hill in the dark tells a particular kind of story, not about what the child believed they had seen, but about the quality of the sensory experience they had been exposed to, the smell, the disorientation, the something in the air that had made eyes burn and throats close. These were physical events happening to real bodies, and the children's bodies had responded with the directness that children's bodies always do. Kathleen May, when she sat down across from Stuart, was visibly shaken. That detail appears in the early accounts, not as a dramatic characterization, but as a simple observation, the kind of thing a reporter notes because it is relevant to the credibility and emotional state of a primary witness. She had walked up the hill as a practical adult, doing something reasonable, and she had come back down as a woman who had seen something she did not have a category for. But she was not incoherent. She was not hysteric. She was a precise person, and she described what she had seen with the precision that would define her account across every retelling for the rest of her life. The mist, the odor, the shape, the specific qualities of the figure's appearance that she had registered in the brief seconds before the group fled down the slope. What she told Stuart that night was the foundation of everything that followed: the newspaper account, the national attention, the investigations, the illustrations made from her descriptions, the decades of interest in what had or had not happened on the Fisher Farm Hill on a September evening in West Virginia. She was the first person to put the account into sustained language, to organize what had been a chaotic and frightening experience into a sequence of specific, reportable details. She had seen it, she remembered it, and she told it clearly, which is why it survived. The group as a whole, Kathleen and her sons, the neighborhood boys, Eugene Lemon, the dog that had gone ahead and then come back or disappeared at the tree line, was a cross-section of a small American community in 1952 in the way that such groups are cross-sections: different ages, different levels of education, different capacities for articulating an experience, held together by the simple fact of having gone up the same hill and come down from it. Changed. They were not researchers. They were not investigators. They were not people who had gone looking for the extraordinary. They were neighbors who had followed two boys' account of a bright light descending on a familiar hill, and who had found, at the top of that hill, something that none of them had been prepared to encounter. The neighborhood from which they had come was the same neighborhood they returned to. The houses were the same. The road that ran through Flatwoods was the same unpaved track it had been an hour before. The night was the same night, the same early September dark, the same Appalachian ridgeline pressing close on all sides. Nothing physical about the community had changed. What had changed was what the people in it were carrying, the specific weight of an experience that had no easy name, that had happened to their bodies as well as their perceptions, and that they would spend the rest of the evening and the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately. Stuart's notepad filled up, the quotes gathered, the names were set down. The rough sketch of the hill and the tree line took shape on the small page. Kathleen May sat across the table from him, her hands still, her voice composed, telling him what had happened in the particular order in which it had happened, the way a precise person tells a story when they want to be understood. The lamp on the table put a warm, limited light over the two of them, over the notepad and the pencil and the names of the people who had walked up the hill together. Outside the windows, the Fisher Farm Hill was still there, as it had always been, a rise of dark pasture against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, the crest holding whatever it held. Tommy Heyer and Neil Whirling had gone home, or were somewhere else in the community, the way children are dispersed back into the ordinary geography of their neighborhood, after something shared and strange. Freddie and Edward May were present in the way that children are present in the aftermath of an event, peripheral, not being interviewed with the same directness as the adults, but there in the room, present to the accounting of what they had all together experienced. Eugene Lemon sat with his unsteadiness, his hoarse voice, his body doing the slow work of recovering from something it had been exposed to and had not liked. Stewart did not rush. A good reporter in 1952, working for a county newspaper with one print run per week, understood the value of getting the account right over getting it quickly. Quickly, in this context, meant an hour's drive to Sutton and a long night of writing, but the account itself needed to be complete, needed to hold up, needed to contain the specific details that would make a story credible to the readers of the Braxton Democrat, who had not been on that hill and had not seen what the May family and the neighborhood boys and Eugene Lemon had seen. He had written down what Kathleen May said about the odor, the powerful particular smell that had hit the group as they reached the upper part of the slope, something metallic and sharp that had made the eyes burn and the throat tighten. He had written down what she said about the mist, a low, dense concentration of vapor sitting at the hilltop, thicker than the general air below, something that the flashlight beam caught and diffused through. He had written down what she said about the figure in the language she used, the head, the eyes, the dark surrounding shape, the lower portion. The words on the page were her words, filtered through his shorthand, which meant they were as close to a first-generation account as the record would ever have. The evening had already begun to acquire the quality that unusual evenings acquire when they are being documented in real time, the sense of events settling into a shape, becoming a story rather than simply a happening, the chaos of experience arranging itself into the sequence that a reporter's questions impose on it. Not distorted by the questions, not shaped dishonestly, but ordered. This happened, then this, then this. Kathleen May answered the questions in that order, and the notepad received them, and the account that would appear in the Braxton Democrat within days was taking form on that small kitchen table in Flatwoods, while September held outside the windows, and the hill stood dark against the sky. After the interview was done, Stewart went back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, reviewing his notes in the small light of the car's interior lamp, the kind of pale, limited glow that makes a reporter's shorthand legible just barely, enough to check that the names are spelled right, that the sequence is clear, that the quoted phrases can be recovered from their abbreviated marks on the page. He could see the May house from the car, its windows lit, the shapes of people visible inside. He could see, if he looked past the house and up the slope, the dark rise of the Fisher Farm Hill against the night sky, entirely still, entirely quiet. The hill looked like every other hill in Braxton County. It looked like the hill it had always been, a piece of West Virginia topography, ordinary and dark and steep, the tree line at the crest a familiar ragged silhouette against the slightly less dark sky. Stewart sat with his notes, and the story was already in his hands, was already more than a local story, was already the kind of thing that a county newspaper prints because a county newspaper is where such things are first named and first placed on record, and because the people who experience them deserve to have someone write down what they say while they are still saying it. He had the account. He had the names. He had the date, September 12th, 1952, and the place the Fisher Farm Hill, Flatwoods, Braxton County, West Virginia, and the witnesses, specific and real, their testimony gathered while the evening was still fresh in them. Whatever had happened on that hill was now on paper, held in pencil marks, in a reporter's shorthand, in a car parked outside a house, where a community was still making sense of its own Tuesday night. The interior light of the car held the small pool of the notepad's surface. Outside, the night continued without event. The hill was dark. Flatwoods was quiet in the way that small Appalachian communities are quiet, late on a weekday, the houses lit within, the road empty, the forested ridges pressing close and dark on all sides. Stewart would drive back to Sutton with the notes on the seat beside him, and the account would go from his handwriting to his typewriter, to the page of the Braxton Democrat, to the hands of the county's readers, and the thing that had happened on the Fisher Farm Hill would become, by degrees, a story. On the seat of the car beside him, the notepad rested. Kathleen May's words in pencil, the names of the children, Eugene Lemon's name, the date, and the hill, and the phrases she had used to describe what the flashlight had found at the top of the slope. A story just beginning to take shape on paper, still warm from the table where it had been told, still carrying the particular weight of a night that none of the people in that community would be fully done with for a long time. On the evening of September 12th, 1952, people across Braxton County and several neighboring counties looked up and saw the same thing moving through the sky above the ridgelines of West Virginia. It was not ambiguous. It was not a slow shimmer at the edge of vision or a pale suggestion of light against cloud. What they reported was a large, bright red object moving with purpose across the sky, vivid enough that multiple independent observers, separated by miles of forested terrain and with no way of comparing notes in the moment, all reached later for the same word to describe its color. Red, distinctly, unmistakably red, and moving fast enough that those who saw it knew within seconds it was not a conventional aircraft and not anything they could name from experience. The accounts came in from across the region. A family in one hollow watched it pass over the tree line and disappear behind the next ridge. A man on a porch in a neighboring county followed it with his eyes until the hills took it. Drivers on unpaved county roads stopped their vehicles and stood at the roadside and tracked it until it was gone. What several of these observers reported was not simply that the object moved across the sky, but that it appeared to slow, to descend, and eventually to settle, to drop below the line of the hills, rather than continuing on any trajectory consistent with a passing aircraft or a burning fragment falling in a long arc. It appeared, to those who watched it long enough, to come down somewhere, to land, or something close enough to landing that the distinction was hard to hold. Later investigation would confirm that a meteor event did occur over the region on the evening of September 12, 1952. That confirmation is part of the record, and it accounts in straightforward astronomical terms for the bright red object crossing the sky, a body of rock and compressed gas entering the atmosphere and burning with that characteristic iron red color as it descended. What the meteor explanation accounts for somewhat less cleanly is the consistent impression shared across multiple independent observers that the object appeared to slow and settle rather than to streak and dissipate. Meteors do not land, they burn and scatter. The impression of settlement, of something choosing a place to come down, is a detail that the astronomical record does not resolve as simply as it resolves the color and the trajectory, and it was that impression, held by several people at once in the early evening dark, that put Edward and Freddie May into motion. The two boys had been outside in the September air when the light crossed the sky above them, and what they described afterward, to their mother and to anyone else who would listen, was not a burning rock passing over, but an object that had gone down somewhere on the crest of the hill that rose behind the Bailey Fisher farm. They had seen it. They had tracked it. They were certain enough of where it had gone that they wanted to go there, and certain enough that they could find it, that they began asking, right away with the kind of animated directness particular to boys of 10 and 11 who have just seen something extraordinary, whether anyone would come with them to look. The Fisher Farm hill was not far. That was part of what made the proposition feel reasonable rather than reckless. It was a known hill, a local hill, a piece of the familiar landscape that every person in the Flatwoods area had seen from the road or crossed at some point. There was nothing about the hill itself that had ever made it remarkable. It rose as the hills of Braxton County rose, steeply, quickly, its lower slopes in pasture and its upper reaches in dense second-growth forest, the crest marked by a tree line against whatever sky was visible above the ridges. To walk up it in the dark was unusual, but not impossible. To walk up it in the dark with a flashlight and a specific purpose, to find where the bright red thing had gone down, was the kind of impromptu expedition that had its own momentum, the kind of momentum that gathers people in. Kathleen May, who had heard the boys and knew the hill and was not a woman given to dismissing what her sons told her with a look and a turned shoulder, agreed to go. Eugene Lemon, who was 17 and had a flashlight and whose National Guard training had given him at least some familiarity with moving at night in unfamiliar terrain, took the lead. Neil Whirling and Tommy Heyer, drawn by the sound of the boys' account and the general energy of the moment, came along. Eugene Lemon's dog came along too, moving ahead as dogs do, working the scent of the hill in the dark. They set out across the pasture in the direction of the Fisher Farm hill, sometime in the early evening, the sky still holding a faint residual light above the ridgeline, but the ground beneath their feet already in the full dark of a September night, in a hollow where no artificial light reached. Eugene Lemon held the flashlight ahead of them, its beam catching the pale dry grass of the late summer pasture and throwing the shadows of fence posts and field stones into brief elongated relief as they walked. The dog moved at the edge of the beam's reach, visible as a shape against the slightly lighter grass, and then gone again as it ranged ahead. What they encountered first was not the figure. Before the figure, there was the smell. The group had climbed the lower slopes of the Fisher Farm hill, the ground steepening under their feet, the dry grass giving way to the moister, denser growth that accumulated on the hillside, where the drainage from the upper slopes kept the soil softer and the vegetation thicker, when the first of them noticed the odor. It did not arrive gradually, building as they climbed, the way a natural smell builds as its source grows closer. It arrived more abruptly than that. Kathleen May, in the accounts she gave in the hours and days after the encounter, described it as something that was simply present at a certain point on the ascent, not faint and growing, but strong, immediately strong, strong enough to register as wrong before there was any visual cause to match it to. The smell was metallic. Several witnesses reached for that word independently. Others described it as sulfurous, or as resembling burning metal, or as the specific chemical quality of something industrial placed without explanation in a field in rural West Virginia where no industrial process had any business being. It produced immediate physical effects. The eyes responded to it. The throat responded to it. The group noted, even as they continued climbing, the air they were breathing had changed character in a way that was not simply the smell of something unfamiliar, but the feel of something with substance, something that the body registered as a presence in the air, rather than merely a scent carried by it. Below the crest, before the tree line that marked the top of the pasture, they walked into the mist. It was not a general fog across the valley or a weather condition that had rolled in over the ridges. The mist the witnesses described was local, concentrated, sitting in the hollow just below the hilltop in a way that suggested it had collected there rather than arrived. It was low to the ground. It was dense enough that Eugene Lemon's flashlight beam, which had been carrying cleanly across the open pasture slope below, entered it and diffused, the light still present but scattered, the beam losing its sharp edge and becoming a broader and softer illumination that caught the suspended particles of whatever the mist was made of and gave the hilltop a quality the witnesses would later reach for words to describe. The mist smelled the same way the air below it had smelled, or stronger, the metallic burning quality, concentrated into the visible thickness of it, so that the two sensory impressions merged into one coherent experience of a place where something had happened. Eugene Lemon's dog had gone ahead into the mist. At some point on the upper slope, the dog had moved out of the flashlight's reach and into the tree line at the crest, and the sound of it moving through the dry September grass had stopped. No one seems to have registered the dog's disappearance as an event in itself at the time. It was simply that the dog was there, at the edge of visibility, and then it was not. And the group continued climbing because they had come to find where the light had gone down, and the top of the hill was close. The dog did not bark. It returned later. It was not injured. What it encountered at the top of the hill before the rest of the group arrived, and what caused it to retreat without sound, is not recorded. Eugene Lemon was the first to see what was at the crest. He swept the flashlight beam to the left, across the tree line, at the top of the hill, in the way that a person with a flashlight in the dark will naturally track the edge of what they can see, following the boundary between the illuminated and the unilluminated, moving the beam along the solid dark of the tree trunks and the dense, low-hanging branches. The beam traveled left. It moved through the mist. It found the lower trunk of a large tree at the tree line, and the pale light of it caught the surface of the bark and the matted grass below, and then it moved a few degrees further, and then it found the figure, what Kathleen May described in the first interview she gave on the night of September 12, 1952, while sitting at her own kitchen table, still in the clothing she had walked up the hill in, her voice steady, but her hands not entirely steady, was a figure of considerable height. Her estimate, and the estimates of the other witnesses who offered one, placed it well above the stature of a large man. The figure stood, or occupied the space near the tree line, with what appeared to be its upper body visible against the dark of the trees, and its lower section situated at ground level, in a way that the witnesses had difficulty accounting for, because what they reported for the lower section of the figure was not legs. The lower portion of what the group saw was described as a large, dark, rigid, pleated structure. The word witnesses reached for was skirt, not as a garment in the ordinary sense, but as a description of the shape, wide at the base, narrowing upward, with a vertical patterning that several witnesses described as folds, or pleats, or mechanical segmentation. It did not have the organic quality of a living thing's lower body. It did not taper into limbs. It appeared to be a casing or a structure, something that enclosed whatever might be below the figure's midsection rather than displaying it. The material, insofar as material could be assessed in the fractional seconds that the flashlight beam held on it before events overtook the observation, was described as dark and non-reflective in some accounts, and as having a slight sheen in others. The disagreement, perhaps reflecting the difference between what different members of the group perceived in that light, at that distance, in that mist. Above the rigid lower section was the upper body, and above the upper body was the head. The head was the detail that every witness returned to independently. The shape of it, that specific shape, is the thing that makes the Flatwoods case distinct in the record, the thing that sets it apart from other encounter accounts in a way that a researcher reviewing the documents decades later cannot simply pass over. Kathleen May described the head as shaped like the ace of spades on a playing card. That comparison is precise. The ace of spades on a standard card is a shape with a broad central mass that widens as it rises and then comes to a point at the top, a roughly symmetrical, vertically elongated spade shape that is wide at its middle and tapers to an apex. May's use of that comparison was not approximate. She repeated it in multiple separate accounts over multiple years. It was the shape she saw, and the ace of spades was the closest familiar form she could find for it. The head was encased in or associated with a structure that witnesses described as a cowl or hood, a surrounding form that extended beyond the head itself, framing it in a way that made it appear larger than it might otherwise have appeared, and that gave the figure's silhouette a quality of heaviness, of enclosed volume, of something occupying and displacing space. The cowl was not loose. It was not fabric moving in the night air. It appeared fixed, structural, part of whatever material the rest of the figure consisted of. The eyes were the other detail. They appeared large, and they appeared to produce light, or to return light in a way that light producing and light returning were difficult to distinguish in the conditions on the hill that night. The color witnesses reported for the eyes varied slightly between accounts, reddish-orange in some, green in others, the variation perhaps reflecting the way a single source of colored light changes character at different distances and through different densities of mist. They were the first thing that confirmed, for Eugene Lemon, in the moment his flashlight found the figure, that he was looking at something that looked back. The figure did not move immediately. That is a detail in the witness accounts that does not get discussed as often as the physical description of the figure itself, but it is there, in the fractional interval between Eugene Lemon sweeping the flashlight onto the figure and the group's flight from the hilltop. There was a moment, brief, present, remembered, in which the figure and the group were simply both there, in mutual proximity, the flashlight beam connecting them, the mist between them still pooled and still smelling of burning metal, the eyes of the figure catching and holding the light. Then something shifted. The witnesses described it variously as the figure turning toward them, or as the figure appearing to begin moving in their direction, or as the figure's orientation changing in a way that, whatever its mechanical cause, the witnesses registered in the body before they registered it in conscious thought. The response was immediate. Eugene Lemon did not make a decision to retreat. Kathleen May did not weigh the situation. The group moved because the body moved, because whatever the human nervous system does when it encounters something in the dark that triggers the oldest of its responses, it did that, and within seconds, the group was moving back down the hill in the full dark, in the mist, through the smell, away from the crest. Eugene Lemon stumbled. He was the largest member of the group, and he had been closest to the figure, and the physical response in him was the most acute. He stumbled, lost his feet on the hillside, and required help getting down. At least one of the children was described by Kathleen May in her account as near hysterical by the time the lower slope of the Fisher Farm Hill gave way to the flat of the pasture below. The group ran through the pasture in the dark. They ran back the way they had come, across the dry September grass, past the fence posts, toward the lights of the road and the houses beyond it, The flashlight was somewhere on the hill. Whether Eugene Lemon had dropped it during the flight, or set it down at some point during the encounter itself, or whether it remained somewhere on the slope, with its beam still casting its pale cone into the dark and the mist, is not clearly established in the accounts. That detail, the flashlight somewhere on the hill, possibly still lit, its glass lens resting in the September grass, while whatever had been at the top of the hill remained or did not remain, is one of those small peripheral facts that the record preserves without explanation. What the witnesses reported in the hours after their return was not only what they had seen, but what their bodies were doing. Eugene Lemon, who had been closest and who had been the most exposed to the odor concentrated at the hilltop, was in the worst condition. His voice was not working correctly. He produced sound, but the sound did not cohere into language with the ease it should have. His body underwent convulsive episodes in the hours after the encounter, not continuous, not sustained, but recurring in the way that a body responds to a significant chemical insult that has not yet been fully metabolized. He was nauseous. He had difficulty standing and difficulty responding to questions with the coherence that a 17-year-old National Guardsman answering questions about what he had just seen would normally have had. Kathleen May reported burning in the eyes and throat. Other witnesses reported the same. The sensation was consistent with what a person experiences after sustained exposure to a chemical irritant, the kind of burning that does not resolve in the first hour, but persists into the night and into the next day, the body continuing to register what it has been exposed to long after the source of the exposure is no longer present. Whether the burning was produced by the mist, by the odor, by some property of both together, or by some other aspect of the environment at the hilltop, the witnesses' physical symptoms did not require their testimony to confirm them. They were visible to the people who encountered the group when they returned to the road. These are the details of that night, as the witnesses recorded them, not in the days after, in the softening glow of retrospection, but in the hours after, while the symptoms were still active, and the memory was still the texture of the body's unprocessed experience, the metallic smell that had no source. The mist sitting low below the crest in a way that mist does not ordinarily sit in open pasture. The tall, dark, cowled figure with the ace of spades head and the eyes that returned the light. The rigid pleated lower section that ended at the ground, without legs, without anything ambulatory, without the visible mechanism of how a living body moves itself from one place to another. The figure glided. That was the word that appeared in the accounts when witnesses described what the lower section of the figure seemed to do. Not walk, not step, but glide, the upper body rotating above a lower section that appeared to remain in essentially fixed relation to itself, even as the whole moved, as though the figure were a structure that translated through space rather than a body that propelled itself through it. That quality, the non-ambulatory movement, the rigidity of the lower casing, the sense of something that was not organized the way a living thing is organized, was as present in the witnesses' accounts as the color of the eyes or the shape of the head, and it contributed as much as either to the impression that what the group had encountered near the tree line at the top of the Fisher Farm hill was not an animal, not a person in unusual clothing, and not any category of thing that any member of the group had a name for. In the days that followed, when Kathleen May sat with an illustrator and tried to produce an image that matched what she had seen, she did not reach for dramatic embellishment. She pointed to proportions. She indicated the width of the head at its broadest point, here, about this wide, wider than a man's shoulders, and the height of the figure relative to the tree behind it, and the height of the tree behind it relative to the slope of the hill. She described the texture of the lower pleated section. She noted where the eyes sat in the face relative to the cowl that surrounded it. The illustration that resulted from those sessions, the canonical image of the Flatwoods figure that would be reproduced in newspapers and magazines and eventually on museum walls and in documentary films, is not a dramatist's invention. It is the product of a witness pointing at proportions on a sketch and saying yes, closer to that, or no, a little wider, a little taller, more like this. That figure, drawn from Kathleen May's descriptions on a kitchen table in Flatwoods in the days after September 12, 1952, has been looking out of that canonical illustration for more than 7 decades. It has the Ace of Spades head. It has the wide, dark cowl. It has the glowing eyes at a height that places them well above the level where a human face would be. It has the pleated dark lower section that ends at the ground without limbs. It is a specific image of a specific thing, not a composite of cultural anxiety or a product of after-the-fact contamination, because it was produced while the memory was still fresh and under the direct supervision of the woman who had stood on the hilltop and looked at the original. Whether what the May group saw at the top of the Fisher Farm hill on the evening of September 12, 1952, was what they believed they saw, a figure, a presence, something that had come down with the red light and waited at the crest, is a question that the record preserves without answering. What the record does establish is that a specific group of specific people climbed a specific hill on a specific night and returned from it, changed physically and otherwise. The smell was real enough to still be detectable the next morning. The symptoms were real enough to last into the following day. The account was specific enough that it produced the same image in the same proportions across multiple witnesses describing it independently. The Fisher Farm hill stood quiet after the group left it. The mist remained pooled at the crest, sitting in the hollow below the tree line in the way it had been sitting when the group walked into it, low, dense, still carrying its metallic quality on the air. The tree line at the top of the hill did not change. The grass at the crest, bent and matted in whatever pattern it had been bent and matted in, lay undisturbed, the dew beginning to settle on it in the way that September dew settles on the West Virginia hills when the night temperature drops and the air gives back its moisture to the ground. Whatever had been near the tree line was either still there or was not, and no one who might have observed either possibility remained on the hill to make that observation. The hill held the question the way the hills of Braxton County hold everything, quietly, densely, with the patience of terrain that has been forested and shadowed and rained on for long enough that the events of a single September night become simply one more thing that happened on the slope, one more thing the grass grew back over and the tree line stood indifferent to. The smell faded, the mist dispersed, the morning light would come eventually across the eastern ridge and move down the slope, the way morning light moves down slopes in the Appalachian Plateau, slowly, the shadow of the ridge retreating before it, the dew-covered grass brightening first at the crest and then on the middle slope and then at the base, the hill returning to the ordinary appearance of every other forested hill in the county. But on the night of September 12, 1952, the night was not finished. The mist was still at the crest. The odor was still in the air above the flattened grass. The question of what had stood near the tree line and turned its eyes toward the group as the flashlight beam found it, that question was already moving with the witnesses down the hill and back to the road, was already being carried in their bodies and their voices toward a kitchen table and an open door and a notepad waiting on a surface and a reporter driving toward the light in a window. the question already outrunning anything that might have remained on the hilltop, the question already free of the hill and traveling, carried forward by the people who had been there into whatever the next hours and days and decades would make of it. The hill stood in the dark behind them, in the quiet of the West Virginia night, unchanged. A. Lee Stewart, Jr. arrived at the Fisher Farm Hill on the morning of September 13th, 1952, while the dew was still on the grass. The light at that hour came in low and pale through the tree line, laying long shadows across the slope. The hill looked, in that morning quiet, exactly as it had always looked, a steep rise of open pasture giving way to second-growth oak and hickory at the crest, the kind of unremarkable terrain that occupied every ridge and hollow in Braxton County without distinction. He climbed it the same way the group had climbed it the night before, though he had the considerable advantage of daylight and the absence of anything waiting at the top. What he found near the crest was not nothing. The grass in one area had been flattened and matted in a pattern that did not resemble the ordinary wear of a hillside pasture, not the scattered pressure of grazing animals, not the simple path left by a person walking through, but something more concentrated and more symmetrical than either of those things. The stems were bent and pressed in a consistent direction, as though something large had rested on them or moved through them in a specific and deliberate way, and the ground beneath the flattened patch was slightly softened relative to the surrounding soil. He noted the approximate dimensions in pencil on his notepad, paced out the rough shape of it, and looked at the tree line nearby. The smell was still there. Stewart described the odor in his notes as persistent and distinctly chemical, not the ordinary smell of a West Virginia hillside in September, which he would have known well, but something that sat at the back of the throat and did not belong there. It was the same odor the witnesses had described the previous night, and its continued presence in daylight, roughly 12 hours after the encounter, was not a detail he could set aside. Odors of biological origin dissipate. Odors of combustion dissipate. Whatever chemical property this one carried had kept it in the air overnight and into the September morning, in a location with nothing present at the site that obviously accounted for it. He wrote it down. He moved on to the ground markings. The marks on the ground near the flattened vegetation were noted in early investigative accounts as consistent with what might be left by a heavy structured object resting briefly on soft soil, not deep impressions, not dramatic gouges, but the kind of subtle compression that suggested concentrated weight applied to specific points rather than distributed across a surface. Some of the early accounts described these markings as roughly symmetrical, appearing in a pattern that suggested the corners or contact points of something with a defined geometry. None of this was subjected to anything resembling controlled forensic documentation. No soil cores were taken. No measurements were certified by an independent laboratory. What survived in the record was Stewart's pencil notes, his published account, and the descriptions offered by other investigators who followed him to the site in the days immediately after. What that record carries, held carefully and without overstatement, is the corroborated word of a working journalist with an established local reputation who returned to the site independently and found physical conditions consistent with what the witnesses had reported. That is a specific and not insignificant thing. Stewart had no evident reason to fabricate details that would have complicated his professional standing in a small community where he was known and where his judgment mattered in practical terms. He found the flattened grass. He detected the chemical odor. He noted the ground impressions. He published what he found under his own name. The vegetation and soil at the crest of the Fisher Farm Hill were not the only physical details noted at the site in the days following September 12th. Investigators and witnesses who returned to the area in the hours and days after the encounter also reported finding an oily or greasy residue on vegetation and on the ground surface in the immediate area where the figure had been seen standing. The residue was noted in more than one early investigative account, described as dark and slightly viscous, clinging to grass stems and surface soil in a way that seemed inconsistent with natural biological material. Alongside this, what appeared to be skid or drag marks were described on the ground, not the impressions left by an animal's hooves or the track of a wheel, but a pattern suggesting something had moved across the surface in a particular direction, leaving a trace of its passage. Neither the oily residue nor the drag marks were ever subjected to documented laboratory analysis. This absence is not a detail to pass over lightly, because what the absence means is that the physical evidence at the Fisher Farm Hill existed in a window of time between its discovery and any formal scientific examination, and in that window, between the morning of September 13th and whatever point investigators might have reasonably organized a controlled response, the physical record simply was not collected in a form that would have made it independently verifiable. What remained was the word of the people who had seen it, and in the case of Ailey Stewart Jr., the published account of a person with professional reasons to be accurate and local reasons to be careful. The question of who else came to the hill in those days and what they found is part of what the record holds and does not fully answer. There were visitors. The Braxton Democrat article moved quickly. People with various levels of investigative seriousness and various motivations came to look at the crest of the Fisher Farm Hill in the days following the original encounter. Some of what they found confirmed the early accounts. Some of what they found was already gone by the time they arrived. The flattened grass persisted for a period. The odor, by some accounts, faded within a day or two. The ground markings, such as they were, survived slightly longer, but nothing at the site was preserved under conditions that would have made a formal scientific assessment possible. And by the time the national coverage arrived, and the interest of investigators with more resources had been drawn to Braxton County, the physical evidence had returned, at its own pace, to an ordinary September hillside. The physical traces were not the only residue the evening of September 12th left behind. In the hours that followed the group's return from the Fisher Farm Hill, several of the witnesses reported physical symptoms that persisted well into the following day, and in some cases beyond. The symptoms were concentrated and specific, not the general unease of a frightening experience, which is a recognizable and well-documented phenomenon in its own right, but a particular cluster of physical effects with a consistent character across multiple witnesses. Nausea, vomiting, persistent irritation of the eyes and mucous membranes, and a sore throat that lingered. Eugene Lemon's symptoms were the most severe of any member of the group, and they were severe enough to require attention. The convulsive episodes reported in the immediate aftermath of the encounter, a loss of coherent speech, an inability to form words or sentences that made sense, a physical distress that went beyond the agitation of a frightened teenager, had, by the following morning, resolved into something more like the sustained after effects of chemical exposure. His voice was hoarse, his hands were unsteady. He sat in a room in the May house on the morning of September 13th, a glass of water on the table beside him, and tried to answer questions about what he had seen, and the effort of doing so was visibly costly in a way that witnesses to that conversation remarked upon. The physical symptoms reported by multiple witnesses across the group, the burning sensation in the eyes, the nausea, the persistent throat irritation, are consistent, taken together, with exposure to an irritant chemical compound of some kind. And this consistency is worth noting for what it implies about the evening's events. The symptoms did not appear selectively in the witnesses who reported the most dramatic visual experience. They appeared across the group in varying degrees, with the most severe effects concentrated in the individual who had been closest to the figure and who had likely been exposed to whatever chemical property the low-lying mist carried. The mist itself, that dense, low concentration of something sitting in the hollow just below the hilltop, was reported by multiple witnesses as separate from their experience of the figure. It was encountered before the figure was seen. It was dense enough that the flashlight beam caught and diffused in it, and it was accompanied, from the moment the group entered it, by the same odor that Ailey Stewart Jr. would find still present at the site the following morning, a chemical irritant suspended in a low-lying mist, concentrated near the hilltop of a rural pasture in September. What might produce such a thing has been a recurring question in the case's long history, and the answers that have been offered do not fully settle it. The natural environment of Braxton County includes no obvious candidate. The odor described by witnesses and independently corroborated by Stewart was not the smell of any local plant material, any common agricultural chemical, or any mineral seep of the kind occasionally found in West Virginia's geology. It had, by the accounts that survive, a metallic or sulfurous character, the smell of something heated or altered, not something occurring in its natural state. Where it came from and what was generating it was not explained by the morning after. It was not explained by the week after. It has not been explained in the 70 years since. Sheriff Robert Carr of Braxton County was contacted after the September 12th incident. The precise timing of that contact, whether it came on the night itself, while the group was still gathered at the May house in a state of considerable distress, or in the hours following, is not entirely clear from the surviving record. What is clear is that Carr was reached, that his office dispatched deputies to the scene at some point, and that the official response to the Flatwoods encounter was by any measure a minimal one. No formal surviving law enforcement report on the incident is accessible in publicly available records. Whatever the deputies who visited the Fisher Farm Hill observed or documented, if they documented anything, did not produce a paper record that survived into the public domain. Carr's public position in the days following the encounter was cautious and non-committal, the measured skepticism of a county official who had a local reputation to maintain and who was not inclined to put his name to a claim he could not personally verify. He did not dismiss the witnesses publicly. He did not confirm their account publicly. He occupied the careful middle ground available to a local official who had received a report of something strange and had no institutional framework within which to process it. His caution was understandable and possibly appropriate. The absence of a formal report is a more complicated matter because it means that the official record from the jurisdiction in which the encounter occurred is effectively blank, and the record that exists was assembled almost entirely by a newspaper reporter working on his own initiative. Stewart's initiative, in this respect, was substantial. He had arrived at the May house on the night of September 12th, while the witnesses were still in the immediate aftermath of whatever they had experienced. Kathleen May, visibly shaken, Eugene Lemon, hoarse and unsteady, the children quieted in the way that children sometimes go quiet after something has moved through them that they do not have language for. He sat down at the kitchen table with his notepad open, and he wrote down what they said. He recorded names. He noted quoted phrases as accurately as he could in the moment, and flagged the ones he was less certain of. He sketched, roughly, the shape of the hill and the position of the group relative to where the figure had been seen. He worked with the discipline of someone who understood that the account being given to him across that kitchen table was going to be repeated, examined, disputed, and assessed by people who had not been in that room, and that the quality of his notes would determine how much of the original testimony survived in a usable form. The notes he made that night became the article he published in the Braxton Democrat, and the article he published in the Braxton Democrat became the primary documentary record on which every subsequent investigation and every subsequent assessment of the Flatwoods case would rest, not because it was a perfect document, but because it was the first document made by someone who had spoken to the witnesses while the experience was still hours old, and who had then gone to the site himself in daylight and confirmed what he could confirm. The residual odor, the flattened grass, the dimensions he could approximate by pacing. These things were in the article because Stewart had been there to note them, and they remained in the article because he had the professional judgment to report them without inflating or deflating what they amounted to. There is a specific quality to the record that a working journalist makes in a small community at the beginning of a story they do not yet know will become large. Stewart did not know, on the morning of September 13th, when he climbed the Fisher Farm hill with his notepad, that the account he was assembling would eventually be carried by national wire services to newspaper offices across the country. He was reporting a local event for a local audience in a county where he knew many of the people involved, where his reputation rested on the reliability of what he published, and where the consequences of getting it significantly wrong would have been immediate and professional. The article he produced under those conditions, specific, careful, grounded in what he had personally observed and what he had directly quoted, is the reason the Flatwoods case has the evidentiary character it has. Without it, the encounter would have remained a neighborhood story told by the people who experienced it, impossible to assess because it existed only in memory. Fuddy Walter Moore. With it, the encounter entered a documented record that has survived long enough to be examined by people who were not yet born when the grass was flattened on the crest of the Fisher Farm hill. The published article in the Braxton Democrat was a physical object before it was anything else. A folded newspaper set in the small serif font of a 1952 small-town press, the headline visible above a column of text that named the witnesses, described the site, and laid out the events of September 12th in language that was plain-spoken and specific. The words Flatwoods and monster appeared in that headline in print for the first time. The word monster was the press's word, not necessarily Stewart's preferred formulation, and not a word the witnesses themselves had consistently used in describing what they had seen. But it was the word that appeared, and once it appeared in print, it became part of the thing, part of how the encounter would be named and categorized and discussed for the next 7 decades. Names have that quality. Once assigned, they are difficult to separate from what they describe. The article moved, not immediately, and not all at once, but within days of publication. The Flatwoods story had begun to travel in the way that regional stories occasionally travel, when they carry enough specific and verifiable detail to justify a wire pickup. National editors who saw it would have recognized something in its structure, named witnesses, a specific location, a journalist who had visited the site and reported physical traces, a physical encounter with defined characteristics that could be reproduced in a summary. These were the elements of a story that could be transmitted and reprinted, and so the article was flagged, the wire was used, and the name Flatwoods, a community of a few dozen families at the center of West Virginia, a place that had no particular reason to be known beyond Braxton County, began to move across the country's newspaper infrastructure toward a much larger audience. The Fisher Farm Hill on the morning of September 13th, seen from the road below, looked like every other forested hill in Braxton County, a dark rise of pasture and tree line, the crest just visible against the September sky, the grass still holding whatever had happened to it the previous night, though from the road no detail of that was visible. The hill gave nothing away from a distance. It occupied its ordinary position in an ordinary piece of Appalachian landscape and presented itself, in the pale morning light, as the kind of place you would pass without a second thought if you did not know what had been reported at its crest. This is a quality the site has held consistently across the years, the quality of looking from any distance and in ordinary daylight, exactly like what it is, a hillside in Braxton County, West Virginia, grass growing back each spring across the same ground, the tree line standing at the crest exactly as it stood before and after September 12, 1952. The physical traces documented in the days following the encounter were temporary by nature. The flattened grass grew back. The ground impressions, if they had depth enough to be visible at all, were smoothed by autumn rain and the ordinary processes of a West Virginia September. The odor that Stewart had detected on the morning of the 13th was gone within days. What did not go away was the account of the people who had been on the hill and the documentation that Stewart had begun assembling within hours of their return. These were not temporary. They had been written down, published, transmitted, and preserved in the way that print preserves things, in archives, in library holdings, in the accumulated record of a case that had entered a much larger world than the one it had started in. The physical traces at the Fisher Farm Hill had a lifespan measured in days. The documented record had a lifespan measured in decades, and it was still accumulating. Eugene Lemon's voice had returned to something like its ordinary register within a day or two of the encounter. His hands steadied. The nausea that had followed him out of the mist on the Fisher Farm Hill passed in the way that physical symptoms generally pass when their cause has been removed and the body is given time. What did not pass in the way that experience generally does not pass was the memory of what had been in the flashlight beam at the crest of that hill on the evening of September 12th. He described it consistently across the interviews that followed, in the days immediately after the encounter, in the weeks that followed, in the years when the case had become something that journalists and investigators and curious members of the public asked him about with some regularity. The consistency of the description across time is part of the evidentiary record of the case, and it is not a small part. Accounts that are fabricated tend to drift. They acquire details they did not originally have, shed details that have become inconvenient, and reshape themselves in response to the pressure of skeptical questioning. Lemon's account did not do these things in any documented way. What he had described in the kitchen at the May House on the night of September 12th, in a voice still raw from whatever the mist had done to his throat, was what he continued to describe. Kathleen May's account had the same character. She was the adult witness, the person who had spoken most clearly and most consistently to the journalists and investigators who came through in the days following the encounter, and she maintained what she had reported through decades of retelling. She pointed in the sessions with illustrators and investigators in the days immediately after September 12th to specific proportions, the width of the figure's head at its broadest point, the height of the figure relative to the tree behind it, the character of the lower section, and the way it did not move in the manner of a body walking. The illustration produced from those sessions The canonical image of what came to be called the Flatwoods monster was a product of her detailed and specific description, offered repeatedly and without significant variation, under circumstances that included an extended period of national attention and the particular scrutiny that comes when a large number of people are actively looking for inconsistencies. The note that Stewart had written at the bottom of his kitchen table sketch on the night of September 12th, a rough marking of the hill's crest, the tree line, and an X for the approximate position of the figure, was a small document in the physical sense. A page in a reporter's notepad penciled in the imperfect lighting of a rural West Virginia kitchen made by a man who had been working quickly and did not yet know how significant it would be, but it was the beginning of the documentary record on which the Flatwoods case rests, and it was made within hours of the encounter itself, before the story had been carried anywhere, before any national attention had begun to shape how the witnesses understood or described what they had experienced. The physical symptoms, the flattened grass, the persistent odor, the ground impressions, the oily residue on the vegetation, each of these details was documented in the days following September 12th by people who had direct access to the site and direct access to the witnesses. None of it was subjected to the kind of controlled scientific examination that would have produced independently verifiable data. The absence of that examination is the most significant gap in the physical record of the Flatwoods case, the point where the documentation ends and the open question begins. What was on that hill? What the mist was composed of? What chemical property the odor carried? And what was generating it? These are questions that the evidence as it was collected in September 1952 cannot answer, not because the people who collected it were careless, but because the systems and resources required to answer them were not brought to bear while the evidence still existed in a form that could be tested. Lee Stewart Jr.'s published article in the Braxton Democrat was, by the end of September 1952, sitting on editors' desks in cities that had no prior connection to Braxton County, West Virginia, in Charleston, in Washington, in New York, in the offices of the national magazines and wire services that moved stories from the periphery of American life toward its center. The article had crossed a threshold from which the Flatwoods encounter would not return to being a local event. It had become a case, a named, documented, publicly examined set of events that had entered the record of the country's 1952 UFO moment and would be assessed, debated, investigated, and revisited for decades by people who had no connection to the Fisher Farm Hill, no personal knowledge of the witnesses, and no access to anything the physical site had held before the grass grew back. The small-town newspaper that had carried it was exactly the kind of document that made this crossing possible, not a sensational publication seeking controversy, but a modest county paper reporting a local event with the particularity and care that local journalism at its best brings to events that matter to the people they affect. The modest newsprint columns of the Braxton Democrat, set in that small serif font and folded once, carried the Flatwoods account forward in time, as print carries things, imperfectly, incompletely, but durably. The physical evidence at the Fisher Farm Hill had a season. The article did not. The hill itself remained. It stood in Braxton County on the morning of September 14th, and on the mornings that followed that, and through the autumn of 1952, as the national attention came and went, and the community of Flatwoods absorbed the strange distinction of having produced a news event that the rest of the country had opinions about. The crest where the mist had pooled was quiet. The tree line at the top was exactly as it had been. The grass in the area of the flattened circle was already beginning its slow recovery. stem by stem, as September grass does in West Virginia when left to its own processes. The hill had the quality that landscape has when events have passed through it, unchanged on its surface, carrying nothing visible of what had happened at its crest, offering nothing to the eye of anyone who approached it in daylight without knowing where to look. What the morning of September 13th had revealed on the Fisher Farm Hill, the specific physical record of a September evening that had left a flattened circle of grass, a chemical odor, ground impressions, eating oily residue on the vegetation near the crest, was not proof of anything beyond what it was, evidence that something had been on the hill the night before. What that something was, and where it had come from, and what the particular combination of mist and odor and figure described by 7 witnesses amounted to, was a question that the physical evidence as documented could gesture toward but not answer. The record held what it held. The hill held the rest, and whatever the hill held, it kept. A. Lee Stewart, Jr. His article in the Braxton Democrat, the physical newspaper, folded once on a wire editor's desk in Charleston, within days of publication. The small headline about Flatwoods, visible above the column of text, was a local story crossing a threshold. It had been reported by a careful man in a small town who had climbed a hill in September and written down what he found. It had been set in type and printed on the cheap newsprint of a county press, and now it was moving in the way that particular stories occasionally move through the infrastructure of a country's press, outward from its origin and into a world that had no prior knowledge of the Fisher Farm Hill, the Bailey Fisher Farm property, the narrow, unpaved roads of Braxton County, or the group of 7 people who had walked up a slope in the dark on a Tuesday evening in 1952 and come back down reporting something that in the weeks and years that followed, no investigation would fully account for. The story had crossed its threshold. From that point forward, Flatwoods belonged to a record larger than the one in which it had begun, and the hill stood quietly in West Virginia, unchanged, while the larger world decided what to make of what had been reported at its crest. On the desk of a wire editor at a newspaper in Charleston, West Virginia, sometime in the middle week of September 1952, a piece of copy arrived from a small Braxton County paper called the Braxton Democrat. It would have looked like what it was, a local item, filed from a rural community of a few dozen families, concerning an unusual report from the night of September 12th. The editor would have read it again, and at some point in that second reading, the story crossed a threshold that most items filed from Braxton County never crossed, and the name Flatwoods moved for the first time across the Associated Press wire to newspaper offices in cities the people of Flatwoods had never visited, and in some cases had never seen. The wire transmission was not dramatic. It was a practical thing, a piece of text converted to electrical signal, transmitted across lines that crossed mountains and rivers and arrived in rooms where other editors in other cities made their own quick assessments. Some passed on it. Others ran it. Within days, the story appeared in newspapers far from West Virginia, in columns that carried the dateline Flatwoods and relayed Kathleen May's account. The hill, the mist, the figure, the glowing eyes, the headlong retreat back down the slope in the dark. The details translated. They carried something that resisted easy categorization, and that resistance was, in its way, exactly what made the story move. What had been a neighborhood event on a Tuesday night, a group of children and a young man and a mother walking up a hill on a farm in Braxton County, was now a matter of national record. The hill was still there, the grass was growing back, the odor, which A. Lee Stewart, Jr. had detected on his morning visit to the site, had begun to dissipate. But the story had left the hill and entered a different kind of territory, one that did not dissipate, one that in fact grew more complex and more detailed and more contested with each passing year. Kathleen May and Eugene Lemon appeared on the nationally broadcast television program We the People. Within the weeks following the encounter, the medium of broadcast television was still new enough in 1952 that sitting under studio lights before a national audience was not a thing most people from Braxton County could have imagined doing. May sat under those lights and spoke in a steady voice. She described the hill, the walk up in the dark, the mist that sat low at the crest, the odor that caught in the throat, and the figure that Lemon's flashlight beam found at the tree line. Her account was the same account she had given A. Lee Stewart Jr. the night of the encounter, the same account she had given her neighbors, the same account she would continue to give for decades in interviews and public discussions and on the record in documentary films. The consistency of her testimony across time was something researchers would note repeatedly. She did not revise, did not embellish in the ways that memory often embellishes, did not allow the accumulated weight of the story's national circulation to introduce details that had not been present in her first telling. She simply described what she and the group had reported seeing on the hill, and she described it the same way every time. Eugene Lemon, seated beside her under those studio lights, offered what the national audience received as evidence of something more than second-hand report. He had been the one who carried the flashlight. He had been the one whose beam had found the figure. He had suffered the most severe immediate physical effects of anyone in the group, the convulsive episodes, the hoarseness, the inability to speak coherently in the hours after the group came down from the hill. Whatever was in his face when he spoke about the encounter, whatever quality of recalled experience was present there, the audience saw it, and the story grew. Ivan T. Sanderson arrived in Braxton County to investigate. Sanderson was a Scottish-born naturalist and science writer with a national platform, a man who brought to the Flatwoods site the habits of a field researcher, systematic observation, dimensional estimation by pacing, notes taken in careful sequence, attention to what the physical record could and could not support. He interviewed the witnesses. He walked the Fisher Farm Hill. He stood at the crest and looked at the tree line where the group had reported seeing the figure. He noted the dimensions of the area where vegetation had been flattened, the character of the residual odor that still clung to the site during his visit, and the consistency between what he observed at the location and what the witnesses had described. Sanderson's published findings appeared in True magazine and reached an audience considerably larger than the Braxton Democrats' circulation. His conclusion was that the evidence was inconsistent with hoax or with simple misidentification of a natural phenomenon. The specific physical characteristics the witnesses had described, the rigid, non-ambulatory lower section that appeared to operate independently of the upper body, the figure's apparent drift rather than walk, the associated odor and its effects on the respiratory system, these were, in Sanderson's analysis, more consistent with a hovering mechanical device than with any biological organism he could identify. That was a careful framing. It was not a claim that the figure was an alien. It was a claim that the specific reported characteristics pointed towards something structured and mechanical, rather than something living in the conventional sense. The distinction mattered to Sanderson, and it would matter to researchers who came after him. Other investigators reached different conclusions. Joe Nickel, working for the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, conducted a detailed analysis of the Flatwoods case and proposed that the figure the witnesses had described was most likely a large barn owl perched in a tree at the crest of the hill. seen in poor light by a group that had walked up the hill already expecting to find something extraordinary. The specific physical details the witnesses reported, the large, round, glowing eyes, the dark cowl-like shape surrounding the head, the impression of great height, the sense of something hovering and stationary, corresponded, in Nichols' analysis, with what a startled barn owl would look like when observed from below with a flashlight in conditions of limited visibility. The wings partially spread, the face disc catching and returning the light, the body appearing to fill the upper portion of the beam's reach in a way that could, in a moment of genuine alarm, suggest something much larger than a bird. It was a careful hypothesis, built from specific ornithological detail and from close reading of the witness accounts. Critics noted that it did not fully account for the physical symptoms that persisted through the following day: the nausea, the eye irritation, the throat soreness, the convulsive episodes reported by Eugene Lemon, or for the odor that A. Lee Stewart Jr. had independently confirmed at the site the following morning. A barn owl does not produce a chemical odor detectable the morning after an encounter. It does not leave residue on vegetation. The hypothesis addressed one portion of the documented record clearly and left another portion unaddressed, and that gap remained, as it had always remained, open. There were other hypotheses developed across the decades. The mass hysteria framework held that the group's shared alarm, the darkness, the sprint up an unfamiliar hill, the prior report of a descending light, had primed each member of the group to interpret ambiguous sensory information in ways that amplified and synchronized the experience, producing a consistent account that reflected the group's shared state of arousal rather than a single external stimulus. This hypothesis addressed the consistency of the account by reframing it as a feature of collective rather than individual perception. Critics of this framework noted that it did not explain Stewart's independent corroboration of the physical traces or the specific technical details of the figure's appearance that the witnesses described before any illustrator had produced a canonical image from their description. The figure itself, the image that Kathleen May helped produce in the days after the encounter, sitting with an illustrator and pointing to proportions on a sketch, became one of the most reproduced and recognized figures in mid-century American strange encounter culture. The wide, dark cowl, and will you to wits get, to guess id friskensingschili wordbar. The reddish orange or green eyes set into the face like 2 points of captured light. The rigid, pleated lower section, described as resembling a skirt or mechanical casing, rising from the ground as though the figure had no legs in the conventional sense. The image carried something. It was specific in the way that only an account drawn from memory, rather than imagination, tends to be specific. The proportions were odd in ways that a purely invented figure would not have needed to be odd. The details were distributed unevenly in the way details distribute themselves when someone is trying to recall exactly what they saw, rather than build something coherent from whole cloth. Project Blue Book logged the Flatwoods incident during the fall of 1952, a period that had produced an unusual concentration of reported aerial anomalies across the United States. The Washington, D.C. radar incidents had occurred in July of that year. Unidentified objects tracked over restricted airspace near the Capitol. Air Force interceptors scrambled, the objects maneuvering in ways inconsistent with known aircraft. The incidents receiving serious coverage and serious attention from people whose professional concern was the security of American airspace. The Air Force was not, in September 1952, in a position to treat unusual aerial reports as inherently trivial. Project Blue Book's assessment of the Flatwoods incident attributed the descending light, the object that witnesses across Braxton County and neighboring counties had reported on the evening of September 12th, to a confirmed meteor event over the region. That much was consistent with independent astronomical documentation. What the project offered in the way of official explanation for the figure, the odor, the physical symptoms, and the physical traces at the site was nothing. The file was thin. The conclusion at the bottom of the summary sheet was typed in capital letters, Meet F. Tier. The rest of the documented record was left in the folder. The official response had been the same pattern that characterized Blue Book's engagement with the more complex entries in its catalog, an explanation provided for the portion of the report that fit within available explanatory frameworks, and a silence extended over the portions that did not. The file was thin. The cabinet that held it was full. For the people who had walked up the Fisher Farm Hill on the night of September 12th, 1952, the decades that followed carried the encounter forward in different ways. Kathleen May continued to speak publicly about the experience across the years. Her account did not change in its essentials. She described the walk up the hill in the dark, the mist at the crest, the odor, the beam of Eugene Lemon's flashlight moving left across the tree line, and then the thing the beam found, the figure, the eyes, the cowl, the stationary lower section, and then the group running back down the slope in full retreat. She described these things in community halls and on television programs and in documentary interviews, and in each setting the account was the same account, the details landing in the same order, the proportions she indicated with her hands, always consistent with the sketch she had helped produce in the days after the event. She did not, by any documented measure, waver. Eugene Lemon's trajectory was different. The physical effects he had suffered in the hours after the encounter, the most severe of any witness, were also among the most difficult to explain within available frameworks. The convulsive episodes, the extended hoarseness, the temporary inability to speak coherently, these were not the effects of seeing a barn owl. Whatever had caused them had produced a specific physiological response that had persisted through the night and into the following day. In later years, Lemon was reportedly more reluctant to speak publicly about the encounter than May had been, and the available record of his post-encounter life is thinner than hers. What can be said is that the effects he reported on the night of September 12th and the following morning were documented by people who saw him in those hours, and that those reports have not been credibly challenged. The Braxton Democrat's article, the small-town newspaper story, with its modest serif columns and its careful account drawn from Stewart's late-night interviews, became a document of historical record. Not because it was the most detailed account of the encounter, and not because it resolved anything that the encounter had left unresolved, but because it was first. It was the record produced on the night itself, in the hours when the witnesses were still visibly shaken, and the experience was still raw, and the details had not yet been shaped by the long process of public retelling. That first account, with its shorthand notes and its rough sketch of the hill, was the closest thing to unmediated testimony the case possessed. The story accumulated around that center. Researchers came, investigators visited the site. Hypotheses were advanced and tested and found sufficient or insufficient, depending on which portion of the documented record each hypothesis was designed to explain. The canonical illustration circulated through newspapers and magazines, and eventually through the early infrastructure of internet image sharing, becoming one of the period's most recognized figures. The figure was reproduced on merchandise, referenced in cultural commentary, and identified by researchers of mid-century science fiction design as a possible influence on certain Japanese tokusatsu character archetypes: the mechanical lower section, the wide cowl, the glowing eyes, the suggestion of something that was neither purely biological nor purely mechanical, but somewhere in the space between those categories. The Flatwoods Monster Museum opened in Sutton, West Virginia, the county seat 3 miles from the community where the encounter had occurred. On a weekday afternoon, the museum's interior is lit warmly, its display cases holding photographs from 1952 and copies of the Braxton Democrat article and the canonical illustration produced from Kathleen May's descriptions. On one wall, that illustration faces the room, the wide dark cowl, the eyes that catch the light, the rigid lower section that the witnesses described as resembling a skirt or mechanical casing. The museum holds the encounter without endorsing a conclusion about it. It presents what was reported, what was documented, and what remains without a satisfactory explanation, and it allows the visitor to stand in front of the illustration and decide for themselves what weight to give it. The annual Braxton County Festival, built around the encounter, brings people to Sutton each year: researchers, enthusiasts, local families for whom the story is simply part of the texture of the county's history. Visitors from outside West Virginia who have followed the case through books and documentaries and the accumulated online commentary of 7 decades. Seth Breedlove's 2018 documentary Flatwoods Monster, A Legacy of Fear, gathered testimony and analysis and situated the encounter within the broader pattern of 1952 aerial reports that had made that fall one of the most active periods in the early history of American UAP documentation. The documentary's title named the cultural resonance the encounter had achieved: a legacy, not merely an incident, something that had grown larger than its origin and continued to carry the weight of an unanswered question across the decades. What the encounter was, on the level of immediate physical event, has not been established to the satisfaction of researchers across the spectrum of interpretive positions. The meteor was confirmed. A bright red object descending over Braxton County on the evening of September 12, 1952, had been reported by multiple independent witnesses across multiple counties, and the astronomical record supported the interpretation of a meteor event over the region on that night. The light that the May brothers had watched settle on, or near the crest of the Bailey Fisher Farm hill, may have been that meteor, its visible trajectory ending at a point on the horizon that appeared to be the hill. Or it may have been something else. The two possibilities, a meteor and something else, have been present in the case from the beginning, and neither has been definitively excluded. The figure at the tree line has not been accounted for by any explanation that leaves no remainder. The barn owl hypothesis addresses the visual characteristics and leaves the physical symptoms and the chemical odor unexplained. The mechanical craft hypothesis addresses the physical symptoms and the non-ambulatory lower section and leaves the absence of any recovered physical evidence unaddressed. The mass hysteria framework addresses the consistency of the account and leaves the independent physical corroboration unexplained. Each hypothesis illuminates a portion of the documented record and leaves another portion in shadow. This is not unusual in the history of anomalous reports. It is, in fact, the condition of most cases that have survived decades of investigation. The cases that persist are precisely the ones in which no single explanation has been sufficient to account for all the documented details. The witnesses were real people. Their names are documented. Their testimony is on record. A. Lee Stewart Jr. published an article in a real newspaper in a real county seat in West Virginia based on interviews conducted on the night of the event while the witnesses were still visibly shaken, and the article's existence is not in question. The physical traces at the site were observed by an independent researcher the following morning, and that researcher's published account is available in the archive. Eugene Lemon's physical symptoms were observed by people who documented them. The encounter entered the national record through normal journalistic channels and was investigated by researchers who disagreed with each other's conclusions, which is the normal condition of any case complex enough to support competing hypotheses. What remains after all of it, after the wire service transmission and the television appearance and the magazine article and the Project Blue Book file and the Braxton County Festival and the museum and the documentary, is the hill. The Fisher Farm Hill stands in Braxton County as it stood in September 1952. The steep rise of pasture and tree line, the crest where the group reported seeing the figure, the ground where the flattened circle of vegetation was observed the following morning, the tree line where the flashlight beam swept left and found whatever it found. The hill has not changed in the ways that matter. The grass grows back each spring across the same ground, the same sequence of seasons moving through the same landscape, the same steep rise visible from the road below, in the way that hills in Braxton County are visible from the roads that curve through the hollows between them. Whatever happened on the hill on the night of September 12, 1952, whatever the flashlight beam found at the tree line, whatever produced the odor and the physical symptoms and the flattened circle of vegetation, happened in a place that is still there. The encounter is not in the archive only, it is in the landscape, lodged in a specific acre of Appalachian pasture, where a group of people ran back down a hillside in the dark and told, consistently, a story that no one has fully explained. The evening of September 12th, 1952 is a fixed point. It does not move. The group walked up the hill, and then they ran back down, and then they told what they had seen, and then the world received their account and turned it over, as it has been turning it over ever since, looking for the edge that explains it, the seam that allows it to come apart cleanly into something familiar. That edge has not been found. The case does not come apart cleanly. What the witnesses reported remains exactly what they reported, held in the same form it was in when A. Lee Stewart Jr. wrote it down at the kitchen table in the May house on the night it happened, and the questions the account opens remain open in the same way they were open then. There is something particular about a case that has survived this long without resolution, not because longevity suggests truth. Many things persist without being true, but because the specific quality of what has persisted in this case is the detail. The detail has not simplified over time. The barn owl does not account for the smell. The meteor does not account for the figure. The figure does not account for the meteor. The case's unresolved quality is not the vague general unresolved quality of a story told too loosely to be pinned down. It is the precise, specific unresolved quality of a story in which every detail is accounted for except the details that matter most. That is a particular kind of open question. It sits differently than a mystery with no evidence at all. The Fisher Farm Hill in the early morning light of September 13th, 1952, the dew on the grass, the flattened circle at the crest, the odor still detectable, the tree line standing exactly as it had stood the night before, giving nothing away, held something that A. Lee Stewart Jr. stood in front of and tried to describe in his notepad, and could describe only partly, because description has limits when the thing being described does not fit cleanly into any available category. He described what he could see. He noted what he could smell. He paced off the approximate dimensions of the flattened area and wrote them down. What he could not write down was an explanation, because he did not have one, and the discipline that had made him a careful reporter was the same discipline that kept him from inventing one. That discipline is what the case still asks of anyone who approaches it carefully. Look at what is documented. Note what the documentation supports. Hold the portion that has been explained and the portion that has not, and keep them separate and resist the pressure, the very human pressure, to allow the explained portion to stand in for the whole. The meteor is confirmed, the figure is not. Those are two different facts occupying the same evening, and treating one as though it resolves the other is a way of not looking at what is actually in the record. Kathleen May described the figure to an illustrator in the days after the encounter, pointing to specific proportions on a sketch: the width of the head at its broadest point, the height relative to the tree behind it, the texture she recalled in the lower pleated section. The illustration that emerged from those sessions has been reproduced for 7 decades. It is among the most widely recognized images to come out of the early history of American UAP and anomalous encounter documentation. Its recognizability is itself a kind of persistence. The image has survived because something about its specific configuration of features does not easily resolve into something else, does not simplify into a barn owl or a swamp gas formation or a military aircraft, does not yield to the pressure that the decades have placed on it to become ordinary. The wide dark cowl, the eyes that return the light, the rigid lower section rising from the ground of a West Virginia hillside on a September night in 1952, while the mist pooled around the base of the trees and the odor moved through the air, and a 17-year-old National Guardsman held a flashlight with unsteady hands, and a mother from Flatwoods stood behind him and looked at something she would spend the rest of her life describing. There is a version of the world in which what the group saw on the Fisher Farm Hill that night was a barn owl, startled and spreading its wings, seen in poor light by people who had already frightened themselves with the walk up the hill in the dark, and the physical symptoms were the result of a naturally occurring chemical irritant in the vegetation at the hilltop, and the flattened circle of grass was pressed down by nothing more extraordinary than the late-season growth pattern of a hillside field, and the whole event was a convergence of ordinary phenomena arriving together in a moment of collective anxiety. That version of the world is available. It is internally coherent. It is the version that explains the most with the least. There is another version in which something landed on the Fisher Farm Hill on the evening of September 12th, 1952, and the group walked up to find it, and what they found was something that has not been cataloged, something whose physical characteristics were precisely as strange as the witnesses described, and the physical symptoms were the effects of proximity to a device or entity whose mechanisms were not biological in any conventional sense, and the odor was a byproduct of those mechanisms, and the figure glided rather than walked, because it was not built to walk. That version of the world is also available. It too is internally coherent. It accounts for the physical symptoms and the chemical odor and the non-ambulatory movement in ways the barn owl hypothesis does not. Neither version has been established. Both are held somewhere in the record as the case has moved through the decades. The case does not require a choice between them. It requires only that both be held honestly, and that the documented details not be simplified to make one or the other easier to accept. The Flatwoods Monster Museum sits in Sutton on a weekday afternoon with its display cases and its warm light and the canonical illustration on the wall. Outside, the county continues, the forested ridges and narrow creek bottoms, the unpaved roads connecting small communities across the Appalachian Plateau, the hill 3 miles north, where the grass comes back each spring. The museum holds the case at a careful distance. It does not tell the visitor what happened. It shows them what was reported and what was documented and what remains without an answer, and it allows the question to rest at that distance, which is the only honest distance from which the question can be held. The hill is there in every season: summer in its dense canopy, autumn in its color burning down through the ridge lines,